It happened on a rainy Thursday, not the kind of rain that dances on rooftops playfully, but the heavy kind, quiet, steady, and full of memory. The kind of rain that makes the world feel smaller and more distant, like it's holding its breath. Arya Vale stood inside the old library's archive room, where most people forgot books even existed. The room smelled of leather, ink, and time itself. Her hands were gloved, delicately brushing dust off the spine of a forgotten manuscript. She didn't look up when the thunder groaned outside. She didn't flinch when the lights flickered. Silence, to her, was more comforting than the sound of voices. Arya was 27 and lived as if she were invisible on purpose. She never answered unknown numbers. She didn't go to parties or smile when people held doors open for her. Her colleagues at the Historical Foundation called her the girl who always whispers, though none of them had ever heard her speak more than a sentence. She wore her long hair in a tight braid tucked into her coat, and her clothes were carefully plain soft grays and muted blues that didn't demand attention. But she hadn't always been like this. There was a time when she laughed loudly, when she used to sing to her younger brother while washing dishes, both of them soaked from the sink and from joy. But that was before the day her world turned in on itself, before the betrayal, before the moment she realized that not everyone who smiles at you wants to protect you. Some just want to own you. Since then, she had built her life around one simple promise: never need anyone again. And yet, life has a strange way of testing the promises we make to ourselves. On this particular Thursday, a knock echoed down the hallway leading to the archive room. It wasn't sharp or urgent, just different, confident. She didn't respond. The room was locked anyway. But then came the sound of the master key being used. Only one other person had access to that key, the director, but the footsteps didn't match his. These were heavier, more deliberate, more expensive somehow. She turned just as the door creaked open. The man who stepped inside didn't belong in a place like this. He looked like he'd never once stood in a room full of dust. He wore a tailored coat, charcoal with subtle pinstripes, and leather gloves that looked more decorative than useful. His presence was too large for the quiet room, like the world had shifted slightly to make space for him. He paused when their eyes met, as if studying her for a moment longer than necessary. "You must be Miss Vale," he said, voice deep, cultured, yet somehow gentle. "I've been told you know how to handle fragile things." She didn't respond. She never did, not right away. He didn't seem bothered by her silence. "My name is Elias Monroe," he continued. "I recently acquired something that needs restoring. It's old, priceless actually, and complicated." Arya looked away, returning her focus to the manuscript. She wasn't interested. People like him didn't show up without expecting control. Money always came with strings. But then, as he set a small leather box gently onto her worktable, she noticed something strange. He wasn't watching her like others did. Not with curiosity, not with amusement, and definitely not with desire. He was watching the room, the shelves, the careful way she moved, like he was taking it all in, not to judge, but to understand. "I was told you prefer email," he said, taking a step back. "But some things can't be communicated through screens." Still, she said nothing, but her eyes flickered toward the box, and he noticed. "It's from the 1800s, he said. "The diary of a girl who vanished. She trusted the wrong person. They never found her body, but they found her words. That made her still. For the first time in a long time, something pierced." Her armor. Elias gently slid the box across the table, his gloved fingers never touching hers. "I'll leave this here, no pressure, but I'd appreciate your help. Only someone with your care and patience could bring this back to life." He didn't wait for an answer. He just nodded once and walked out, leaving a scent of winter cologne and unspoken promises behind. It was hours before Arya finally opened the box. Inside was a faded journal, leather peeling at the edges. The first page had only one line written, in delicate, slanted ink, "If you're reading this, then you're the only one who might still believe me." Arya's heart caught in her throat. Something inside her, something long buried and locked away, shifted. For the first time in years, she wasn't just restoring someone else's past. She was about to face her own, and she had no idea how much. Elias Monroe already knew, but she would learn slowly or all at once, and nothing would be the same again. The next morning, Arya found herself staring at the journal again. She hadn't meant to. She had placed it carefully back into its box the night before, telling herself she would forget about it, just like she forgot about everything else that tried to pull her back into the world. But it sat on her desk like it was waiting. She turned on the reading lamp, the soft golden light pooling over the leather cover. Her fingers hovered above it, hesitant. And then, with a breath she didn't know she was holding, she opened it again. The next few pages were filled with the delicate handwriting of someone long gone. A girl who seemed afraid of everything, yet bold enough to write it all down anyway. Her words weren't just entries, they were confessions, memories, warnings, and something else Arya hadn't expected. Loneliness. Real, unfiltered, raw. The kind that echoed inside people who kept too many secrets and trusted too few hearts. As she read, something tightened in Arya's chest. Then came a knock on her office door. Soft, deliberate. She closed the journal and stood slowly, not sure why her pulse quickened. The door opened slightly. Before she reached it, Elias Monroe stood in the hallway, holding 2 coffee cups. "I figured you might not have had breakfast," he said, not stepping in. "I don't mean to interrupt." Arya blinked. She hadn't had anyone bring her coffee since she couldn't even remember when. She didn't reach for it. She just looked at him, trying to figure out what it was about his voice that didn't raise her defenses the way others did. He smiled softly and set the cup on the side table without pushing further. "If you've read any of the diary, I'd like to hear your thoughts, but only if you want to, still." She said nothing, but something about the way he stood there, patient, not expecting her to perform, not even expecting her to speak, unnerved her in a different way, like he had time, like he didn't come to take anything from her, just to see what she would do next. When he left, she stood by the coffee cup for a long while. She didn't drink it, but she didn't throw it away either. Later that week, she began cataloging the diary officially, labeling each page, scanning carefully. With each word she translated, she saw pieces of herself reflected in the girl from the past. Their fears were different, but their silence was the same. And both had known the kind of heartbreak that rewires how you trust the world. It was 2 days before Elias returned. This time, he brought nothing, said nothing at first. He just leaned against the bookshelf, watching her hands move across the fragile paper. "You read quietly," he said finally, "but I can tell you're listening to more than just the words." Arya looked up. His voice wasn't smug. It was observant. "I used to be a little like her too," he said, "always writing everything down, as if that would protect me from forgetting." She hesitated, then did something she hadn't done in months. She spoke, soft, quiet, but clear. "Did it work?" Elias looked at her, really looked, and shook his head. "No, but it helped me forgive myself." Silence settled again, but this time it wasn't cold. Something was shifting in the air between them. Not attraction, not romance, something deeper, something like recognition. He didn't ask about her past. She was grateful. Most people pushed. He never did. Instead, he pulled a worn photo from his pocket. It was a black and white image of a girl young, maybe 16, with eyes too heavy for her age. Arya saw immediately it was the same girl from the diary. "She was my aunt," Elias said softly. "Disappeared before I was born. My mother said no one wanted to remember her. But I couldn't forget someone I never met." He paused. She deserved more than silence. Arya stared at the photograph. Something inside her trembled. "Why me?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Then finally, "Because I think you know what it's like to be erased." That night, Arya stayed late. She read until her eyes ached, and the room was dark. One entry caught her breath. "He told me I was safe, but safety isn't always soft. Sometimes, it's the strength to stand still when everything else is running." She closed the journal gently. And for the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar moving inside her. Not fear, not grief, something smaller, but brighter, like the beginning of a crack in a wall she'd built to hide for too long. She didn't know it yet, but Elias Monroe wasn't just offering her a job. He was offering her a choice. To stay hidden, or to Be seen. And slowly, the world she thought she had protected herself from was starting to knock louder. She had never been to that side of the city before. Everything about it was different, the way the streets curved, the way the buildings didn't lean in tiredly like they did downtown, and especially the silence that wasn't heavy with sadness, but filled with possibility. Arya stood in front of the tall iron gate, staring up at the Monroe estate. It wasn't a mansion that tried too hard to impress. It was older, quieter, and carried history in its bricks, like it belonged to someone who didn't need to prove anything anymore. Just behind the gate was a garden, wild and beautiful, like it had never been trimmed to please guests. She liked that. It felt real. The invitation to come here hadn't been forced. Elias had simply said, "If you ever want to see where she grew up, I'll be there," and left it at that. She hadn't replied. But now here she was, standing at the edge of someone else's memories, not quite sure what brought her here. Curiosity, maybe, or maybe it was the need to understand why a stranger's story felt so deeply personal. The gate opened slowly with a soft creak, and she walked through. Elias didn't greet her at the door. Instead, a kind woman with silver hair welcomed her inside without questions. She led Arya through quiet hallways filled with books and photographs. There were no security guards, no polished marble floors, just warmth and echoes. The library was at the back of the house. Elias was already there, seated by the window, surrounded by pages, photocopies, letters, sketches, and newspaper clippings. He looked up and smiled, not surprised to see her. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come," he said gently. Arya said nothing, just took in the room. It was peaceful, but full of energy, like something important was trying to speak through the silence. He motioned to the seat across from him. "I thought you'd want to see what wasn't in the journal." Laid out before her were pieces of a puzzle that hadn't been solved in decades. School records, a letter written by the missing girl's teacher, a torn photograph with half a face missing, and a map with red markings round a lake far north. She was trying to leave, Elias said quietly. She had a plan, but someone found out. Arya sat slowly. Her hands trembled just slightly as she picked up a letter. It was dated just a week before the girl disappeared. The ink was shaky, desperate. "I don't want to be afraid of him anymore, but no one believes me." That line hit something in Arya's chest like a bruise being pressed. She remembered being 17, standing in front of a counselor who kept telling her to just speak the truth while her voice had been locked so tightly in fear. It physically hurt to open her mouth. She remembered what it was like to not be believed, to be called overdramatic, emotional, confused. Elias watched her face carefully, but didn't intrude. "I've traced everything I could," he said, "but something tells me you'll see what I couldn't." Arya blinked. "Why do you care so much about someone who died before you were even born?" He looked away for a long moment. "Because no one fought for her when it mattered, and maybe that's why the silence kept going, until people like her, and people like you, had to carry it." The room fell still. He wasn't just talking about the girl in the diary anymore, and they both knew it. He didn't ask her what happened in her past. He didn't offer her pity. He offered her something far more dangerous, the chance to matter, later. That evening, as the sky turned gold outside, Elias brought out a small wooden box from the back of the shelf. Inside was a necklace, simple, worn, and unpolished. It was wrapped in a silk cloth, folded carefully as though someone had placed it there with great care. "She wore this every day," Elias said, "but they never found it with her things." Arya stared at it. "She trusted someone," he said. "That's what makes the story so tragic. She didn't just disappear. She believed she was finally safe." The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was thick with understanding. And then he added something Arya wasn't expecting. "I don't want you to work for me anymore," he said, voice low. Her eyes snapped to his, confused. "I want you to work with me." He slid a thin folder across the table. "This is the proposal. Funding, travel, access to records sealed by the estate. But only if you want to help me uncover everything." She stared at the folder, then at him. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't trying to win her over. He was offering her purpose, a chance to step outside the careful bubble she had wrapped around herself. Not into chaos, but into meaning. That night, she didn't sleep. She reread the journal. She looked at the necklace. She thought about what it meant to be believed, to be seen without needing to speak. And in the darkness of her apartment, where every light was off except the one above her desk, she quietly wrote a note on the edge of the diary's page. Maybe her voice didn't disappear. Maybe she just needed someone to listen. And for the first time in nearly 10 years, Arya opened her laptop, typed a reply to Elias' offer, and hit send. 3 words, "I'm ready now." But she didn't yet know that the more truth they uncovered, the closer they were stepping to something that had been buried for a reason, and someone out there still didn't want it found. She never expected the past to follow her into the present so quickly. 3 days after she accepted the offer, Arya was on a train heading north, with Elias beside her. He wasn't talkative, something she found strangely comforting. Most men filled silence with noise. He didn't. He let the quiet settle between them like a familiar blanket. It was the kind of silence that didn't demand anything from her, but she could feel his energy shift the closer they got to their destination. The town they were headed to wasn't on most maps anymore. Once a prosperous lakeside community known for its vineyards and paper mills, it had slowly crumbled into obscurity after the 1960s. The girl from the diary, Clara Monroe, had vanished from there without a trace. As the train pulled into the small, rusting station, Arya's pulse quickened. This wasn't a research trip anymore. It felt like stepping into someone else's memory. Someone who had cried here, laughed here, disappeared here. Elias led the way through the narrow streets to a quiet inn on the edge of the woods. The place smelled like pine and old stories. Arya didn't sleep the first night. Her window looked out onto the lake, and the stillness of the water unnerved her. It looked too calm, too silent. The next morning, they visited the town record's office. Arya expected dust and clutter. What she found was something else: locked cabinets, missing files, newspaper archives with pages ripped out. The woman at the front desk smiled tightly when Elias asked about Clara Monroe's case. "That was a long time ago," she said. "Nothing worth digging up now." But Arya knew that tone. She'd heard it before from people who had seen things, who had looked the other way, and who had chosen silence over truth. Later that afternoon, Elias handed her a folded note. Someone had slipped it under his door at the inn. "Stop asking questions. Let the dead rest." Her throat tightened. Someone knew they were here, and someone wasn't happy about it. That evening, they walked the trail leading up to the cliffs overlooking the lake. Arya brought the journal. Elias brought an old photo he had recently found: Clara standing beside a boy with dark eyes, and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. On the back, a name was scribbled in pencil: Micah Talbot. He was her closest friend, Elias said. Some say more than that. But after she vanished, he disappeared too. No one ever found him either. The sun dipped below the trees as Arya flipped through the journal. Toward the end, Clara's entries had changed tone. They became more rushed, more afraid. "Micah says I should leave soon, that someone found out. I'm scared. But I trust him. I have to." Arya looked up. What if he wasn't helping her escape? What if he led her into the woods? Elias frowned. Then why disappear too? She shook her head. Maybe he didn't. Maybe someone just made it look like he did. The wind picked up, brushing past her like a whisper. The woods below them were darker now, and the lake reflected nothing but night. When they returned to the inn, something had changed in Elias. He looked more guarded. She found him standing at the window of the sitting room, watching the trees. "I grew up hearing Clara's name in hushed tones," he said quietly. "My mother would go silent every time someone mentioned her. It's like the whole family agreed to forget." Arya stood beside him. "Why didn't you?" He turned, looking at her, not just her face, but her, the part of her she thought no one could see. "Because I know what it feels like to be the one no one defends." There was something in his voice then, a heaviness. "You're not just doing this for her," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't deny it. "My father wasn't the man everyone thought he was. He taught me how to hold a wine glass, how to command a boardroom, but not how to respect boundaries. not how to care without controlling. Arya felt the air shift. Elias stepped back. I don't tell people that. She looked at him carefully. Why tell me? He gave a tired half smile. Because you don't run away when people reveal their damage. You listen, even if it hurts. She wanted to respond, but a knock came at the door. It was the innkeeper, pale, shaken. You should come see this, he said. They followed him to the back entrance. On the ground, beneath the window of Elias's room, lay a folded piece of paper and a shattered glass bottle. The paper was damp, but still readable. Ask one more question, and she disappears too. There was no signature. No need for one. This wasn't just about Clara anymore. Now it was personal. Arya didn't speak for a long time after the innkeeper left. She stood in the hallway, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the paper like it was a ghost. Elias stood a few feet away, waiting. Are you okay? He finally asked. She nodded, though it was a lie. I knew it would hurt digging into the past. I didn't know it would follow us into the present. He reached out, slowly, carefully, offering her his hand, not in a way that demanded trust, but in a way that offered it. She didn't take it. Not yet. But she didn't step away either. And that was something. The next morning, they made a choice. They weren't going home, not until they found the truth. The woman at the diner spoke without making eye contact. She kept wiping the same corner of the counter, again and again, as if the answer she was giving had to be scrubbed clean before it left her mouth. I remember Clara, she said, her voice low. Pretty girl, quiet, always looked like she had a secret in her pocket. Arya leaned forward, gently placing the photocopy of the diary's last entry on the counter. This handwriting, she wrote it 2 days before she vanished. The woman finally glanced up. Her eyes were tired. That's when everything got strange. First her, then Micah, then the stories. Elias was beside Arya, silent, watching the woman the way someone watches the edge of a cliff carefully, and never all at once. She said someone found out about them. Arya added, do you know who she meant? The woman hesitated, then whispered. Everyone thought it was Micah's father, sheriff back then, mean man, but powerful, kept the town in line. Arya felt the air grow colder. He's gone now, Elias asked. She nodded. Years ago. But the people who protected him, they're still here, still watching. Later that night, back at the inn, Arya couldn't sleep. She sat near the window, the journal on her lap, Elias reading through a stack of old town records on the floor. The atmosphere had shifted. They weren't researchers anymore. They were trespassers. I don't think Clara died by accident, Arya said suddenly. Elias looked up. I think she was silenced, and everyone agreed not to remember. He nodded. Then we have to make them remember. They started visiting houses quietly. People didn't want to talk, but some couldn't help it when Arya showed them the photograph of Clara and Micah. A few old men averted their eyes. One woman teared up but said nothing, and one man, who lived alone at the edge of town, finally cracked. She came here, he whispered. Clara, the night before she vanished, said someone followed her. She asked to use my phone. Arya leaned closer. Did she call anyone? He nodded. Her sister. Elias straightened. She had a sister. The man hesitated. No one talks about her. She left town soon after. Married. Changed her name. Arya felt her chest tighten. Do you know where she went? He scribbled a name and an address on a slip of paper. Don't tell anyone it came from me. The next day, they drove 2 hours west to a quiet neighborhood with white fences and trimmed lawns. The woman who opened the door looked nothing like Clara, but her eyes, they carried the same storm. Arya explained everything. The journal, the missing files, the threats. The woman didn't flinch. She stepped aside and said, "Come in." Inside her home, the walls were filled with books and photographs. One frame near the fireplace held a picture of Clara as a child, smiling with her arms wrapped around her older sister. She was my shadow, the woman said, voice breaking. Never went anywhere without telling me. Arya asked gently, "Do you believe someone hurt her?" "I know it," she said, but no one listened. "My father told me to stay quiet, said she'd embarrass the family." Elias's jaw clenched. Arya took the journal out of her bag and placed it on the table. She left pieces of herself behind, she said. She never got to tell the whole story. But maybe you can help finish it. For the first time in years, the woman reached for her sister's words and began to read, and something in her face changed, like a door opening just an inch. I have one thing, she said finally, something Clara gave me. I've kept it hidden all these years. She returned with a small tin box. Inside was a cassette tape, labeled in Clara's handwriting, in case I don't make it out. Arya stared at it, frozen. We'll need to find a player, Elias said. They found one at a local pawn shop that afternoon. Back at the inn, they gathered around the recorder. When Arya hit play, Clara's voice filled the room, fragile, breathless, and trembling. I don't know if I'll be able to say goodbye, the voice said, but I need someone to know the truth. What followed was a confession, a story of fear, of betrayal, and of someone she thought she could trust turning into a threat she didn't know how to escape. Names were mentioned, places, the lake, the cliffs, the last meeting. I think Micah is in danger too, Clara's voice said. He doesn't see it, but I do. The tape clicked off. Arya couldn't breathe. Elias closed his eyes. That was never meant to be buried. They didn't speak for a long time. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they both knew what came next. It wasn't just about the past anymore. They had evidence, and now they had enemies. The silence that night wasn't peaceful. It was full of eyes watching, and they both knew they were running out of time. The cassette disappeared the next morning. Arya woke to find the inn's sitting room ransacked, papers scattered, chair overturned. The recorder smashed into the floor like it had been stepped on in a rush. But the tape itself, the only living voice Clara had left behind, was gone. Elias stood in the doorway, jaw tight, eyes unreadable. No broken window, no forced door, he said. Someone had a key, or someone paid for one. Arya didn't speak. She was too still, too cold inside. That tape had been more than a clue. It had been a piece of Clara's soul. And now someone had tried to erase it, again. They packed their things in silence and left the inn by noon. No goodbyes, no explanation. The farther they drove from the town, the more Arya realized something had changed in her, not from fear, but from a deeper, sharper place. She was tired of being careful, of being the girl who whispered her thoughts into notebooks and shut herself away from the world. Someone didn't want Clara's truth to come out, but someone had already failed, because now that truth lived in Arya, too. They returned to the Monroe estate 3 days later. Elias moved quickly, making calls, securing legal counsel, hiring a forensic specialist to verify the copy they had made of the diary entries, and transcribed audio. But Arya had already decided what she needed to do. She would speak in front of the board of the Monroe Family Foundation, a gathering of men and women in polished suits who once called the disappearance a tragedy best forgotten. Arya stood beside Elias and read directly from Clara's journal. Not softly, not timidly, clearly. Brave. Eli, this wasn't just a girl who ran away, she said, voice steady. This was a girl no one protected. A girl who warned us what silence costs. The room shifted. Eyes dropped. But others, older women, a few younger faces, leaned in, listening. Elias stood beside her, not saying much. He knew this moment wasn't his. After the meeting, as the board quietly agreed to reopen the investigation into Clara's disappearance, Arya stepped outside into the crisp wind and stared up at the clouds. She felt something inside her she hadn't felt in years. Weightless. I never asked, Elias said beside her, hands in his coat pockets, why you stayed so silent all these years. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because when I did speak, no one listened. And then I realized if the world doesn't want your voice, it trains you to believe it's safer to be quiet. He nodded slowly. And now? He asked. Arya exhaled, the breath full of memory and release. Now I speak, even if no one listens, because I heard her, and maybe someone will hear me too. 2 weeks later, a podcast picked up Clara's story. Then a journalist, then a non-profit for survivors contacted Arya, asking if she would help guide a project that gave voice to other cold cases. She almost said no. She almost retreated, but then She saw the photo Clara at 17, eyes wide, still full of hope, and she said yes. She told her story, to not everything, not the parts she still hadn't forgiven herself for, but enough to light the path for someone else. Elias never pushed. He never asked to be the center, but he was always there when she needed quiet company, or when she forgot how to breathe under the pressure of being seen. And slowly, very slowly, Arya let herself lean not in weakness, but in trust. He wasn't a savior, and she wasn't broken. They were two people with pieces missing, helping each other find what they thought they'd lost forever: belief. It was almost spring when the police found bones near the lake, a pendant buried in the dirt, Micah's initials carved into a rotting beam from an old boathouse. Closure doesn't always come like thunder. Sometimes it comes like a whisper on paper, or a girl finally choosing to speak. And for Arya Vale, the girl who once lived like silence was survival, speaking became her freedom, and she would never be erased again.